Okay, I have here a meta-analysis on father involvement in early childhood um, by Harris. Um, Harris talks about the importance of including fathers in the studies of the effects of involvement on social emotional development. Um, um, as child's psychological adjustment to divorce, for example, would be in terms of behavior problems, academic achievement, and overall mental health. Um, he highlights the transition to into school um, as a critical period for early childhood development. This preparation for entering kindergarten and first grade is called school readiness. And school readiness includes self-control, assertion, cooperation, social competence, self-concept, self-esteem, and emotion and behavior regulation. He focuses on the father's contribution, separate from the mother's contribution, in conjunction with three specific moderators: socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and father's residential status. He says it's hard to detangle socioeconomic status from race, ethnicity, and this was the beginning of an awareness for me with regard to some articles. For example, he criticizes Fagan's study, F-A-G-A-N. Fagan, I had read some other articles and chose not to include them because they seemed like they were slanted. The study was created to support a conservative political viewpoint. So he criticizes Fagan's study with regard to Puerto Rican fathers who were found to have an effect, their social confidence having a similar effect on their children's social competence. And he found that socioeconomic status could have been more of the cause. So residential status affects child outcomes, but they found more in terms of quality, not quantity, in terms of father's residential status, and outcomes of social development, such as closeness, quality of interaction, and emotional commitment. I'll move on to, he also goes on to say that clarifying what father involvement might actually mean would be. The second one here is the impact of divorce on children, a socioeconomic and legal study. This is somewhat biased, this article, but it does have some interesting elements in terms of an Indian cultural perspective. The Indian Constitution and the UN General Assembly resolution on the Convention on the Rights of the Child places a primary duty on parents and then on the state. And this is also in the Indian Constitution. He considers certain rights, establishing a stable home for the child close to divorce standard of living. Custodial arrangements have a great effect on the child during divorce, and in the situation where there's potential harm to the child, a guardian ad litem is introduced, and that was some new information for me. Some interesting pieces about Indian culture and custody. The father has the sole guardianship of the child, but the mother has the primary right to custody. I thought that was interesting. Other rights, such as the mother's right to custody of males until the age of 2, and of girls until a girl reaches puberty. But the courts also take into consideration the best interest of the child. I introduced, since this was so slanted toward the father, I introduced some Colorado data. Colorado custody is often joint custody. and that's unique about Colorado. So this article is on trauma and divorce, reducing the impact of separation on children. Dean McKay, PhD, describes trauma, such as witnessing combat or natural disasters or vicarious kinds of trauma. And he says the psychological ramifications of the divorce process are considerable, cannot be overlooked as potentially traumatizing on the children involved, because they don't really understand what's going on and the process is out of their control. He refers, McKay in this Trauma of Divorce article refers to attachment styles. And this was interesting, that when a divorce occurs during a period of development when a child's attachment is not fully developed, the likelihood of a secure attachment is reduced. That was new for me. So he has another interesting way of writing, in that he takes a scenario and then applies each of the different moderators or discussions to that same story. He talks about custody again as one of the most traumatic parts to divorce. And this was a unique part of this article, that legal professionals are often the only ones who are available to coach parents about how to reduce the effects of divorce on children. So one of the ways we could intervene is to help coach legal professionals. I thought this was a well-written article. Associations between family structure changes and children's behavior. The writers Claessens and Ryan would have better called it and children's behavioral development, because that's really what they're talking about. The subtitle is The Moderating Effects of Timing and Marital Birth. The authors distinguish between married and fragile families or unwed family. They also consider that, and they're considering in this study whether the family structure changes during the first 3 years of life, is what they're talking about, are more significant than at other stages. The differences, there are differences between married with two parents and going to a single family or going to a blended family, and they explored that. Compares different types of changes on two biological parent families. They incorporate the life course theory into their article, and the timing of the disruption in the children's life. I thought, and you might think, that children from fragile families or unwed families would be just as affected by divorce. But they found that children in fragile families or unwed families may suffer less. And moving into step families had a lesser effect on child's behavior. Let's see. So the consideration that divorce would more affect children during early childhood, and she suggests during the first 3 years of development, is because more intense parenting and more brain development is happening during that time. So she's toward the early end of that 3 to 6 time frame, as well as the formation of attachment. So the impact of change in the family structure would be greatest to overcome during this phase. Also, parents of children in the early childhood age range are younger, so they have weaker emotional and economic resources. So children may be more susceptible within this environment, and public policy should focus on family instability during this time more than in later periods, she suggests, or they suggest. Some other things about the perception of fragile or unwed parents is that the ideas of separation are more normative for fragile families, and the likelihood that the father will cohabitate with extended kin may buffer the destabilizing effect of family change. Also, they address unmarried couples with higher conflict, more, for example, interpersonal violence, and ending those relationships might improve the climate of that home. So I think I have one more. I think I've covered them. I have one more that's two more. The family influences on the development of a child's behavior. This was based on a survey, and to tell you the truth, it doesn't really seem like the survey got to what the goals were, or they didn't say what the goals were. So this purpose was to determine the extent of awareness of family influences on the well-being of the child. But they really should have said it was about to study the extent of values development on the child, because that's what it revealed. He goes on to say, Mahali Hali goes on to say that diversion from two-parent families, from the two-parent family, children don't do as well in school. It was also the participants in the survey were from the Master's College for Christ and Scripture, so it was a biblical scriptural college, which brings along its own value system, I think, and would to studies. It talked about politeness and how parents show respect for each other, the effects of aggressiveness, that children, again, don't do well in school from divorced families, and a person marries someone with similar characteristics as their parents. So it really seems like it was more values focused. They really focus on the role of the father and go as far as to say that the father commonly comes to stand for the absolute necessity of social order more than any other person. I did follow the trail of this family pediatrics report that he refers to often in this study, and it's a legitimate pediatrics, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and he concludes that children of divorced families are at greater risk for emotional and behavior problems, including depression and poor school performance, social difficulties, and problem relationships with one or more parents. And this can continue into adulthood with marital instability. So although it was biased, it brought up some interesting issues. So lastly, I have The Effects of Marriage and Divorce by Berlin, presented before the Science, Technology, and Space Subcommittee of the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation in the U.S. Senate. He began with touting his connection to the Bush administration, and including that their goal was to assist low-income families. The most important thing about this article was that he introduces concepts of marriage education programs, and I thought that was valuable. PrEP, for example, Preparation and Relationship Enhancement Program, teaches skills such as active listening and self-regulation of emotions for conflict management and positive communication, topics such as commitment, forgiveness, and expectations clarification. Who doesn't need that in a relationship? But it would be important that this wasn't required, but offered to parents or young married couples. He also talks about the financial stress that creates marriage instability, and cites a couple of statewide attempts to ameliorate the income barriers. So in Minnesota, the Minnesota Family Investment Program supplements income until